For a single AI campus in northern Louisiana, 3 new natural gas power plants have already been approved. 7 more are proposed. If the full build-out goes ahead, together they would add roughly 7.5 gigawatts of new generation, enough to expand Louisiana's entire generating capacity by more than 30%. All of that driven by the power demands of one company's artificial intelligence. And that is not an isolated story. It is the visible edge of something the International Energy Agency has already put a number on. An advanced server rack, a machine the size of a refrigerator, could by 2027 reach peak power demand equivalent to roughly 65 average households. Scale that kind of power density across an entire AI data center, and a typical AI-focused facility can consume as much electricity as 100,000 homes. The largest ones under construction as of 2026 will consume 20 times that. Every conversation about artificial intelligence is a conversation about chips, about NVIDIA, about who has the fastest processor, who trained the biggest model. That conversation is incomplete. Chips need somewhere to run, and in 2024, the world's data centers consumed roughly 415 terawatt-hours of electricity, more than double what a country like Poland uses in a year. By the International Energy Agency's own projection, that figure is set to more than double by 2030, to a level roughly equal to the electricity consumption of Japan, the world's 4th largest economy. So here is the question this film is built around. For years, every government, every company, every investor has been racing to secure the smartest chips on Earth. But by 2030, the chip may no longer be the thing that decides who wins the artificial intelligence race. Something far older, far heavier, and far less glamorous will decide it instead. Something that cannot be manufactured in a fabrication plant in Taiwan, cannot be patented, and cannot be shipped overnight. The question is simple. What happens when the machines that are supposed to reshape the global economy start running out of electricity to run on? And this is not only a corporate problem. While American companies scramble for turbines and grid connections, other governments are already treating electricity itself as a tool of state power, the same way oil-producing nations once did. This film is about chips and kilowatts, yes, but underneath that, it is about which nations understood, before anyone else, that the 21st century's most important resource was no longer sitting on chip fabrication lines in Taiwan. It was sitting in the ground, and in the water, and in the reactors they'd already built decades ago. But to understand why this matters, you first need to see exactly where it sits on the map. To understand where the artificial intelligence race is actually being decided, you have to stop looking at Silicon Valley and start looking at the electrical grid. Specifically, you have to look at a patch of land in Loudoun County, Virginia, 30 miles from Washington, D.C., a place the industry itself calls Data Center Alley. As of 2025, this single county holds roughly 4 gigawatts of installed data center capacity. To put that in perspective, 4 gigawatts is close to the entire generating capacity of a country like Croatia. It sits inside one county. Virginia's dominant utility, Dominion Energy, reported that by 2023, data centers already accounted for roughly a quarter of all the electricity it sold across the entire state. Not a quarter of one city's power, a quarter of Virginia's power. And the queue of new data centers waiting to connect to that grid, waiting for permission, waiting for wires, waiting for turbines, has grown so long that Dominion's own connection backlog runs to roughly 40 gigawatts, against a statewide peak demand of about 25 gigawatts. In other words, the data centers that want to plug into Virginia's grid would need almost double the power the entire state uses at its busiest moment. Virginia is simply the most extreme case of a pattern repeating across the United States. In Texas, the grid operator ERCOT was reviewing roughly 474 gigawatts of proposed new electricity demand by early August 2026, about 90% of it from data centers. The entire Texas grid's record peak demand, set in July 2026, was about 91 gigawatts. The requests on the table are more than 5 times the size of that record peak. This is the first thing you need to understand about the AI build-out. The demand being proposed is not a modest addition to the existing electricity system. In many regions, it is larger than the system. Compare this to how the problem is being handled elsewhere. While American utilities measure their backlogs in years and their queues in gigawatts, nobody expects to be built. The governments competing hardest for AI investment, the Gulf states, China, a handful of energy-rich smaller nations, are not fighting their own grids. They are commanding them. That distinction between a country negotiating with its own regulators and a country simply issuing a decree is the thread this film will keep returning to. It is the difference between an economy adapting to a resource constraint and a state weaponizing a resource advantage. Globally, the International Energy Agency's April 2025 report, the agency's first ever dedicated to this subject, put 2024 data center electricity consumption at approximately 415 terawatt-hours, or about 1.5% of all the electricity used on Earth. Their central projection has that figure reaching roughly 945 terawatt-hours by 2030, a level that would, on its own, use as much electricity as the entire country of Japan uses. And this demand is not growing at the same pace as the rest of the electricity system. Global electricity use overall is expected to grow at around 3% a year through 2030. Data center demand is growing at closer to 15% a year, more than 4 times faster. Even the IEA is careful to call its 2035 figures preliminary explorations rather than firm forecasts, because so much of what gets built by 2030 is already locked in by construction timelines that take years to unwind. Other institutions push the numbers even higher. The Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory's December 2024 study estimated that US data centers alone could consume anywhere from 325 to 580 terawatt-hours by 2028, as much as 12% of all US electricity. The Electric Power Research Institute and the consultancy Bain both put that same 2030 ceiling near 9% of the entire US grid. Boston Consulting Group's higher estimates put it near a quarter of the entire 2023 US power supply, consumed by data centers alone. The World Resources Institute, reviewing every major projection side by side, found 2030 estimates ranging from 200 terawatt-hours to well over 1,000, a 5-fold spread that tells you how new and unsettled this entire field of forecasting still is. What is not in dispute is where the growth concentrates. The United States and China together account for roughly 80% of the world's projected increase in data center electricity demand through 2030. The honest answer is that no one knows the exact number yet, because the pace of construction keeps outrunning the forecasts written to describe it. What every one of these institutions agrees on is the direction: up and fast. To make that abstraction physical, as of 2025, IEA researchers noted that an individual advanced server rack, the kind being installed in the newest AI facilities, could soon draw as much electricity as 65 average households. Scale that kind of power density across an entire hyperscale campus, and you arrive at the figure this film opened with. One facility consuming as much power as a mid-sized American city. This isn't only an American story. In Ireland, a country that spent the last decade courting American technology companies with low taxes and English language talent, data centers consumed roughly 22% of the country's entire electricity supply by 2024. So much that the government imposed, and only lifted in December 2025, a moratorium on new construction around Dublin. Malaysia, in the state of Johor, has become the overflow valve for a Singapore that ran out of room and power years earlier. Johor holds around 80% of Malaysia's entire operational data center capacity, and the country approved more than $30 billion in related projects between 2021 and mid-2025. And Virginia is not alone even within the United States. By 2023, data centers already accounted for roughly 15% of electricity sales in North Dakota, 12% in Nebraska, and 11% each in Iowa and Oregon, states most people would never associate with the AI boom at all. So the picture that emerges is this. Artificial intelligence is not simply a software phenomenon happening somewhere in the cloud. It is one of the most geographically concrete industrial build-outs of the 21st century. Physical buildings, physical wires, physical turbines, sited in specific counties, straining specific grids, owned by specific utilities. In 2025 alone, the largest US technology companies spent more than $400 billion combined in capital expenditures, much of it tied to data centers and AI infrastructure. And their own guidance for 2026 points to another sharp increase, with Wall Street analysts projecting the industry could pass $1 trillion a year by 2027. And in almost every one of those places, the same problem is emerging at the same time. The companies building the data centers can raise the capital. They can buy the chips. What they cannot always do, no matter how much money they have, is make the electrons show up on time. Because behind every one of these gleaming new campuses sits a much older, much slower, much less forgiving system, the power grid it depends on. And that geography hides a fragility almost nobody talks about, until it breaks. If chips are the easy part of the AI race and power is the hard part, then the last 2 years have been a scramble. 4 of the world's richest companies, each discovering the same problem at roughly the same moment, each reaching for a different solution. To understand where this is heading, you need to follow each of them separately, because each one reveals a different piece of the mechanism. And then you need to step back and look at the machinery underneath all 4 of them, because that machinery, not any single company's strategy, is what actually sets the pace of this race. Start with Microsoft. In September 2024, Microsoft signed a 20-year agreement with the utility Constellation Energy to buy the entire output of a reactor that had not generated a single watt of power since 2019, 3 Mile Island Unit 1, sitting beside the more infamous Unit 2, the site of America's worst nuclear accident in 1979. The plan? Restart the undamaged reactor, rename it the Crane Clean Energy Center, and dedicate all 835 megawatts of its output to Microsoft's data centers. The project's price tag is roughly $1.6 billion. In November 2025, the US Department of Energy closed a $1 billion loan to help finance it, with the first disbursement expected in early 2026. Here is the detail that matters for understanding the shape of this race. As of the middle of 2026, Crane is not yet producing power. It is under restoration. More than 200 workers have been rehired. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's review is underway, and the restart timeline, originally set for 2028, has been pulled forward to 2027. Microsoft chose, in other words, the fastest available path to new nuclear power. Don't build a reactor from scratch. Revive one that already exists, whose licenses, cooling infrastructure, and grid connections were already built decades ago. And even that fastest possible path, reusing 40-year-old infrastructure instead of starting from bare ground, still takes the better part of 3 years from signature to switch on. That single fact tells you almost everything about why the rest of the industry went looking for other options. Google and Amazon made the second bet. Both companies chose a different path from Microsoft's, not reviving old nuclear plants, but financing an entirely new category of them: small modular reactors. Factory-built units, a fraction of the size of a traditional plant, designed to be manufactured in pieces and assembled on site in months rather than years. In October 2024, Google signed the world's first corporate agreement to buy power from a fleet of these reactors, built by a company called Kairos Power. Up to 500 megawatts across 6 or 7 units, the first expected around 2030, the full fleet by 2035. Kairos is building its demonstration reactors, called Hermes, at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Construction on the first unit began in mid-2024. The regulator approved the second unit in November of that year. Amazon made a parallel move, investing $500 million directly into a competing SMR company, X Energy, and backing plans for up to 5 gigawatts of its reactors across multiple sites, including one in Washington state, targeting the early 2030s. X Energy went on to raise a further $700 million in a funding round led partly by Amazon in 2025, before going public in April 2026 and raising just over $1 billion on the Nasdaq. Notice the pattern. Google and Amazon are not solving a short-term power problem. They are buying power for the next decade and betting billions of dollars on companies that have yet to deliver nuclear power at commercial scale. Look at the balance sheets behind these deals. NuScale, the most advanced publicly traded small modular reactor company in the country, reported an operating loss of roughly $690 million for 2025. Oklo, another prominent SMR developer that broke ground on its first reactor at Idaho National Laboratory in September 2025, reported a net loss of around $105 million the same year. These are functionally pre-commercial nuclear developers, companies that have yet to deliver power at commercial scale, even as investors bet heavily on the promise of AI-driven demand. That is the honest state of the nuclear renaissance as of 2026. Real capital, real construction permits, real government backing, and not yet a single commercial watt delivered. The IEA tracked the pipeline of small modular reactors linked specifically to data center operators, nearly doubling in a single year, from 25 gigawatts of planned capacity at the end of 2024 to 45 gigawatts by late 2025. That number describes ambition. It does not describe electricity. Governments are trying to accelerate this. In May 2025, the White House issued a set of executive orders explicitly tying nuclear expansion to artificial intelligence demand, targeting a quadrupling of US nuclear capacity from roughly 100 gigawatts to 400 gigawatts by 2050, 10 large reactors under construction by 2030, and at least 3 pilot reactors reaching criticality by July 4, 2026. That deadline was met. By early July 2026, 4 small experimental reactors from Arlo Atomics, Antares Nuclear, Valar Atomics, and Deployable Energy had achieved criticality under a Department of Energy pilot program at sites including Idaho National Laboratory and Utah's San Rafael Energy Lab, the first privately funded advanced reactors to do so on US soil in more than 4 decades. It is a real milestone, and a small one. Each of these is a demonstration-scale device, built to prove a design works, not to deliver power to anyone's data center. In December 2025, the Department of Energy separately selected the utility TVA and the reactor developer Holtec for up to $800 million combined to support new small modular reactors in Tennessee and Michigan. None of this changes the underlying physics of construction. Executive orders can compress a regulatory review. They cannot manufacture turbines faster or make concrete cure quicker. But they are a signal of how seriously Washington treats electricity as a matter of national competitiveness, not just utility planning. Then there is Meta, and Meta chose neither restart nor next-generation nuclear. Meta chose gas, and at enormous scale. In August 2025, Louisiana regulators approved 3 new natural gas power plants, roughly 2.3 gigawatts combined, to feed a single Meta data center campus in Richland Parish, called Hyperion. 7 months later, in March 2026, Meta expanded the plan dramatically. 10 gas plants in total, roughly 7.5 gigawatts of capacity, an $11 billion build-out that would increase Louisiana's entire statewide grid capacity by more than 30% to serve one company's data centers. In April 2026, regulators voted to fast-track the review of those 7 additional plants, not to approve them outright, with a final decision expected in December 2026, alongside a proposed commitment of up to 2.5 gigawatts of renewables and roughly 240 miles of new transmission line. The campus is projected to reach close to 5 gigawatts of total demand by 2032, pending that vote. Meta separately issued a request for 1 to 4 gigawatts of nuclear power starting in the early 2030s, a hedge for the next decade. But through 2030, in Louisiana, the honest answer is gas, at a scale roughly 9 times larger than Microsoft's entire nuclear restart. This is the mechanism you need to hold in your head for the rest of this film. Nuclear power, whether a restarted 1970s reactor or a brand new small modular design, is the cleanest long-term answer and the slowest one to arrive. Natural gas is dirtier, politically messier, and can be running within a few years. Which is why, across the entire US data center build-out in the mid-2020s, gas is doing most of the actual work, while nuclear does most of the actual headlines. And then, in November 2024, the system pushed back. Amazon and the utility Talon Energy had structured a deal to connect Amazon's data centers directly to Talon's Susquehanna nuclear plant, behind the meter, meaning the power would flow straight from reactor to data center without crossing the shared public grid at all. It was, in effect, a way to claim a nuclear plant's output for one customer while leaving everyone else to compete for whatever power was left. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission rejected the amended version of that agreement, voting 2-1 against it. The Commission's concern was straightforward. If the largest and richest companies in the world can reserve dedicated nuclear output for their own private use, everybody else, households, hospitals, small businesses, is left competing for a shrinking pool of shared capacity at whatever price that scarcity produces. Amazon and Talon restructured the deal by June 2025 into a more conventional arrangement, a front-of-the-meter power purchase agreement running through 2042, worth an estimated $18 billion in lifetime revenue to Talon. Amazon got its power, but it had to get it through the shared system, like everyone else, and the ruling became an important precedent for subsequent hyperscaler nuclear arrangements. Widen the lens past any single company, because the actual bottleneck isn't corporate strategy. It's physical hardware, and a queue most people have never heard of. Three companies dominate the global market for the heavy-duty gas turbines large power plants need: GE, Vernova, Siemens Energy, and Mitsubishi Power. By early 2026, GE Vernova's order backlog for gas turbines alone had grown to 100 gigawatts, and the company told investors it expected that backlog to reach at least 110 gigawatts by the end of the year, a figure confirmed in its first quarter 2026 filing, which reported 25 turbines shipped in that quarter alone, a 32% year-on-year increase. Siemens Energy reported a record backlog worth roughly 136 billion euros, built from roughly 194 turbines sold in 2025 alone. Mitsubishi Power is sold out through 2028. Wait times for a new gas turbine, which used to run 2.5 to 3 years, have stretched in some cases to 7. The IEA separately notes that lead times for transformers and high-voltage cable, the unglamorous parts of the grid nobody puts on a press release, have roughly doubled in 3 years. The grid connection process itself has become its own bottleneck, and the scale of it is almost hard to describe. A 2026 study by Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, using data through the end of 2025, found that more than 2,060 gigawatts of proposed generation and storage projects were sitting in interconnection queues across the United States, roughly double the entire country's installed capacity, all waiting for permission to plug in. The typical wait, from application to actually switching on, exceeds 5 years for projects completed in 2025. And history suggests most of these projects will never make it that far. Of everything that entered US interconnection queues between 2000 and 2018, only around 19% had actually been built by the end of 2023. The rest withdrew, stalled, or died in the queue. Which means the eye-catching numbers you sometimes hear in the news, Texas grid requests of over 400 gigawatts, Virginia connection queues near 40 gigawatts, should be read less as commitments and more as a lottery, most tickets of which will not be redeemed. Regulators are attempting to fix this. In 2023, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission adopted new rules, known as Order 2023, meant to process interconnection requests in batches rather than one project at a time, specifically to cut through backlogs like this one. Whether that reform meaningfully shortens a 5 to 8 year wait remains, as of 2026, an open question. The backlog remains enormous even after the new rules took effect, despite easing somewhat in 2025. Inside PJM specifically, the regional grid operator covering 13 states from Illinois to Virginia, the wait from application to commercial operation has stretched from under 2 years in 2008 to more than 8 years by 2025. PJM's own long-term forecast projects 32 gigawatts of peak demand growth between 2024 and 2030, with roughly 30 gigawatts of that growth, nearly all of it, coming from data centers alone. Goldman Sachs research estimated in February 2025 that meeting projected global data center power demand growth through the end of the decade would require roughly $720 billion in grid infrastructure spending alone. New substations, new transmission lines, new transformers, on top of whatever the power plants themselves cost to build. That number does not build a single reactor or a single gas turbine. It only pays for the wires connecting them to everyone else. So this is the shape of the AI energy race as it stood by mid-2026. It is not one clean technology solving one clean problem. It is 4 different companies making 4 different bets. A nuclear restart racing toward 2027, small modular reactors racing toward 2030, a gas build-out racing to be first online, all competing for the same scarce turbines, the same scarce transformers, the same 5 to 8 year queue positions on grids that were never designed to add a Croatia's worth of demand in a single county. Money is not the constraint anymore. Physical capacity is, and physical capacity, unlike capital, cannot be raised in a funding round. Every one of these 4 strategies is also a story of the world's richest companies negotiating, one project at a time, with a system built for a different century. That negotiation takes years, and while it happens, other governments are not negotiating with anyone. They are simply building the power first and inviting the companies in after. That gap between negotiation and command is what turns an infrastructure problem into a geopolitical one. But the real story isn't just what happens on America's map. It's what happens on everyone else's, and what the money does when it starts moving there instead. If the story inside the United States is a scramble for scarce power on aging grids, the story outside the United States is almost the opposite. A handful of countries and companies have figured out how to skip the scramble entirely by controlling power, permits, and chips together before a single shovel goes into the ground. And where that happens, the AI race isn't being run, it's being pre-decided by whoever can say yes the fastest. Start in the Gulf. In May 2025, the United Arab Emirates announced Stargate UAE, a 5-gigawatt AI campus in Abu Dhabi, with an initial 1-gigawatt cluster built by the Emirati firm G42 in partnership with OpenAI, Oracle, NVIDIA, SoftBank, and Cisco. The first 200 megawatts are targeted for the third quarter of 2026. What makes this project different from anything happening in Virginia or Texas isn't the scale, it's the sequencing. This is a sovereign state directing its own utilities, its own regulators, and its own capital toward a single outcome, simultaneously. What makes the project different is the degree of coordination. Land, power, permitting, and capital can be aligned far more directly than in fragmented US utility processes. The site's power mix is being built from the start as a blend of nuclear, solar, and gas, planned as one system rather than negotiated plant by plant with a regulator that answers to someone else. Saudi Arabia is running the identical playbook through its own state AI company, Humane, with initial sites in Riyadh and Dammam, each targeted at roughly 100 megawatts, aimed at coming online in the second quarter of 2026. In November 2025, the US Commerce Department approved both G42 and Humane to purchase tens of thousands of NVIDIA's most advanced chips, up to 35,000 units each, under a new framework allowing as many as 500,000 advanced American chips into the UAE per year. Microsoft alone has committed over $15 billion to UAE projects between 2023 and 2029. Power, land, permits, and chips, the 4 ingredients that take years to align inside the United States, arrive in the Gulf as a single, state-brokered package, approved at the pace of a government meeting rather than the pace of a public utility docket. Norway offers a quieter version of the same advantage, and it costs almost nothing to build because it was built decades ago. Stargate's second site outside the US is being built in Narvik, inside the Arctic Circle, where an initial 230 megawatt phase is targeting around 100,000 GPUs online by the end of 2026. Norway isn't racing to build new power plants to supply it. It's selling existing hydroelectric capacity, power that has been flowing reliably and cheaply since long before artificial intelligence was a business plan. Where American developers are fighting gas turbine backlogs 7 years long and interconnection queues that strand roughly 80% of proposed projects, Norway is simply monetizing infrastructure that has been sitting there, generating for half a century. It is among the cheapest kinds of new AI power available, precisely because much of the underlying generation infrastructure is not actually new. Malaysia's Johor state tells a similar story from the demand side, a country absorbing a neighbor's overflow. When Singapore effectively froze new data center construction between 2019 and 2022 over power and land constraints, the industry didn't disappear. It moved 40 minutes north across the border. Johor holds roughly 80% of Malaysia's entire operational data center capacity, and the country approved more than $30 billion in related projects between 2021 and mid-2025, with national capacity projected to roughly triple from around 1 gigawatt in 2025 to 3 or 4 gigawatts by 2029. Malaysia's advantage isn't cheap power exactly. It's proximity to a market that ran out of room, combined with a government willing to say yes quickly. But even willing hosts are starting to ration. The same Malaysian government that welcomed $30 billion in AI infrastructure has simultaneously paused approval of non-AI data centers, unwilling to spend its limited power and water reserves on lower-value projects. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Even a country actively courting this industry, seeing the revenue and the jobs it brings, has concluded that its electricity and its water are finite enough that it has to choose which customers get them. If the country pulling in tens of billions of dollars is already rationing, that tells you something about how tight this resource has become globally, not just in the constrained corners of the American grid. Set all of that against the country running the largest and most different bet of all: China. By the International Energy Agency's estimates, roughly 70% of the electricity powering China's data centers still comes from coal, with about 20% from renewables and 10% from nuclear. China commissioned 21 gigawatts of new coal capacity in just the first half of 2025 alone, the fastest pace of coal construction the country has seen since 2016. Read that number against everything you've just seen in Louisiana. Meta's entire Hyperion gas build-out at full scale is 7.5 gigawatts. China added nearly 3 Hyperions worth of coal capacity in 6 months and treated it as routine. At the very same time, China is running the largest nuclear construction program on Earth, roughly 58 gigawatts of nuclear capacity already operating, more than 30 gigawatts under construction, over half of all nuclear construction happening anywhere in the world, and 10 additional reactors approved in April 2025 alone, worth an estimated $27 billion. Beijing's newly adopted 2026 to 2030 plan targets roughly 110 gigawatts of operating nuclear capacity by the end of the decade. The IEA projects that by 2035, the combination of nuclear and renewables will supply roughly 60% of the power for China's data centers. But that transition happens after 2030, which means through 2030, the honest description of China's AI build-out is that coal remains the backbone, renewables expand rapidly alongside it, and Beijing is simultaneously building the world's largest nuclear pipeline for the decade after. This is not a story of one country winning and one losing. It is two entirely different theories of how to win. The United States is layering a gas bridge underneath a nuclear promise. Burn gas through the 2020s, restart and build reactors for the 2030s, and hope the timeline holds against turbine shortages and 8-year interconnection queues. China is doing the reverse. Overbuild coal for guaranteed baseload, while simultaneously constructing more new nuclear capacity than the rest of the planet combined. Betting that abundant power, regardless of the carbon it produces, matters more than how clean that power is. Both strategies are, underneath the different politics, admitting the exact same thing, that in this race, whoever secures reliable electricity first gets to decide what artificial intelligence can actually do, not whoever writes the most elegant algorithm, and not whoever owns the most advanced chip. Which raises an uncomfortable question for the country that started this race. The United States holds the most advanced chip technology in the world. It has the largest capital markets in the world. And yet, on the specific resource that determines how fast that capital and that technology can actually be deployed, it is competing against sovereign wealth funds that can approve 5-gigawatt campuses by government decree. Against a country with a hydroelectric surplus it finished building decades ago. Against a state so tight on power, it rations which industries are even allowed to apply. And against a rival superpower willing to commission coal plants at a pace not seen in a decade, as part of a broader strategy to guarantee abundant, reliable power. Whether this balance holds depends on a handful of dates worth tracking. The small demonstration reactors have already proven the physics works. What has not yet been proven is whether the small modular reactors promised for 2030 come online without delay, and whether reforms meant to shorten interconnection queues actually work. If both land on schedule, the bottleneck eases, and nuclear starts doing more of the work gas is doing through 2030. If they don't, and nuclear construction has rarely finished on schedule anywhere in the world, then gas, and whichever country can build it fastest, keeps winning by default. Power, in other words, has become the new export commodity of the 21st century. Chips can be shipped anywhere with an export license. Capital can move at the speed of a wire transfer. But gigawatts cannot be airlifted. They have to already exist, in the ground, connected to a willing grid. And the countries that can supply that fastest are starting to attract the capital, the chips, and the companies that used to default automatically to the United States. Which leaves us with one final question, the one that changes how you'll read the news going forward. So go back to the question this film opened with. The world has spent the 2020s treating the AI race as a contest of chips. The evidence in this film points to a different conclusion. But there is one more piece of evidence, the clearest, most concrete proof of everything this film has argued. And it comes not from a tech company's press release, but from an electricity auction almost nobody outside the power industry pays attention to. PJM is the regional grid operator covering 13 states and 65 million people, from Chicago to Washington, D.C. Once a year, it holds an auction where power plants bid to guarantee electricity for the coming years. And the clearing price of that auction is, in effect, a real-time verdict on how tight the grid has become. In the 2024 to 2025 auction, that price cleared at $28.92 per megawatt day. 1 year later, for 2025 to 2026, it cleared at $269.92. Very close to a tenfold increase, the largest single-year jump in the auction's history. In two of the hardest hit zones, prices came in even higher than the regional average. $466.35 in the Baltimore gas and electric territory of Maryland, and $444.26 in Dominion's Virginia territory, more than 15 times the prior year's regional price, in the exact zones carrying the heaviest data center load. PJM's own independent market monitor, the office that exists specifically to explain price moves like this one, attributed 63% of that increase directly to data center demand growth, translating to roughly $9.3 billion in additional costs that get passed on to customers across the region. This is not an activist's estimate or a politician's talking point. It is the grid operator's own watchdog naming the cause. And then, in December 2025, the story got worse. PJM ran its auction for 2027 to 2028 delivery, and for the first time in the organization's history, it could not procure enough capacity to meet its own reliability target, falling short by roughly 6,600 megawatts, even with prices already sitting at the regulatory cap. PJM's own analysis attributed nearly all of the shortfall's underlying demand growth, nearly 5,100 of the roughly 5,250 megawatts, to data centers. The chairwoman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission called the results, in her own words, very concerning. That gap between an auction and a family's mailbox is smaller than it sounds. In Washington, D.C., residential electricity bills rose roughly $21 a month starting in mid-2025, with the district's own consumer advocate attributing about half of that directly to the capacity price spike. Consumer advocates in Maryland estimated bill increases in some areas approaching 24%, and New Jersey's Rate Council projected increases of roughly $12 to $15 a month for households there. None of these households built a data center. None of them asked for one. They are simply sharing a grid with companies whose electricity demand is measured in gigawatts. Reuters, citing analysis from the consultancy ICF, reported that households across the PJM region could face electricity rate increases of up to 60% over 5 years if these trends hold. A projection, not a certainty, but serious enough that it has become a live issue in state legislatures from Trenton to Richmond. This is where the story stops being about engineering and starts being about politics. In November 2025, candidates in both New Jersey and Virginia won governors' races campaigning partly on anger over rising utility bills. 13 states, plus Washington, D.C., formed a bipartisan coalition of state legislators specifically to push back on PJM. A bill requiring large power users to shoulder more of their own grid costs passed a U.S. House committee by a vote of 52 to 0, a level of bipartisan agreement that, in the American Congress of the mid-2020s, is itself remarkable. Texas passed a law in June 2025 requiring large data centers to accept mandatory power curtailment during shortages and to contribute toward the cost of the infrastructure they use. Ireland, after years of restricting new data centers around Dublin, lifted its moratorium in December 2025. But only on the condition that new facilities generate at least 80% of their own power from new renewable sources, and feed surplus power back into the public grid. So here, finally, is the answer to the question this film opened with. Is the artificial intelligence race being decided by chips or by energy? The evidence assembled here points in one direction. The companies with the fastest, smartest models in the world have discovered that intelligence is not the constraint. Electricity is. Microsoft is racing to revive a nuclear reactor that has sat dark since before some of its own engineers were born. Google and Amazon are betting on reactor designs that do not yet exist at commercial scale. Meta is burning gas at a scale that will reshape an entire state's power grid, because gas is the only thing fast enough to keep pace with demand. And sovereign states, the UAE, Norway, Malaysia, China, are discovering that the ability to guarantee power quickly and without a fight has become one of the most valuable strategic assets a country can offer the companies building the next era of the global economy. The countries and companies that understood this first are not the ones with the best algorithms. They are the ones who understood early that the 21st century's most important infrastructure race was never really about the chip inside the machine. It was about what powers it. And as the 2020s close, that answer will not be written by engineers or by CEOs or by the companies spending hundreds of billions of dollars to win it. It will be written by whichever grid, whichever government, and whichever country can keep the lights on. If you want to understand where power, geography, and money actually collide, not the version you get from the headlines, but the one underneath them, subscribe to Meridian Theory and turn on notifications for what comes next.